Could Meghan Markle really be involved in one of the most explosive royal controversies in recent memory? You might be thinking, no way. She's across the pond, far removed from Andrew's scandals. But what if I told you that the threads of this story stretch farther than anyone imagined? Into the very corridors of Buckingham Palace, into private conversations, and even into moments that were deliberately hidden from the public eye. This isn't just about Prince Andrew. It's about power, reputation, secrets, and the subtle ways one figure, yes, Meghan Markle, may have influenced events from afar. The question we need to ask ourselves is simple. What really happens when scandal collides with royal duty, family loyalty, and a public that refuses to forget? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. On October 17th, the announcement came that stunned everyone watching the monarchy. Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, confirmed he would no longer use his title. The reasons were clear: the persistent shadow of his past association with Jeffrey Epstein, the resulting controversies, and a growing public outrage that refused to die down. But the details behind the scenes, the conversations that shaped this decision, and the subtle forces at play are far more complex than anyone could guess. And right at the heart of this unfolding drama, King Charles III himself, who was forced to navigate the delicate balance between family loyalty and the need to protect the crown's image. It was a decision that would not only redefine Andrew's public standing, but also shift the dynamics within the royal family in ways that are only now beginning to come to light. Imagine being Charles, standing in the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by centuries of tradition, faced with a choice that pits personal loyalty against the expectations of an unforgiving public. Every word, every gesture, every private conversation had the potential to become tomorrow's headline. And yet, Charles had to act, decisively, carefully, and with a strategy that no one outside the palace walls fully understood. But let's take a step back. This story doesn't start on October 17th. It begins years ago, with scandals, alliances, and public perception slowly chipping away at Andrew's position in the monarchy. His ties to Epstein weren't just a matter of legal scrutiny. They were a moral and reputational minefield. And as the years passed, what might have been quietly managed behind closed doors began to spill over into the public consciousness. Every interview, every statement, every media report became a brick in the wall that would eventually force Andrew to step back. And yet, even as the public thought they understood the narrative, forces were moving behind the scenes that nobody could anticipate. Enter Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge. Often portrayed in the media as the steady, graceful, almost invisible force behind the monarchy, Catherine's role in this saga is anything but passive. In moments of crisis, she has repeatedly demonstrated an uncanny ability to assess power dynamics, manage public perception, and intervene in ways that subtly shift the balance of influence. When Andrew's scandal reached its tipping point, it wasn't just Charles who was involved in the decision-making. Catherine, with her keen sense of timing and perception, stepped in, quietly, deliberately, taking control of aspects of the fallout that would otherwise spiral out of control. This is where things get interesting. Because while the world saw Andrew losing his title, few could grasp the careful orchestration behind that announcement, or the way Catherine positioned herself as both protector and strategist. And then, there's Meghan Markle. Yes, Meghan. It might seem improbable. She is across the Atlantic, ostensibly distanced from palace affairs, building her own brand and navigating her life in California and beyond. But Meghan has always been a master of media influence, of shaping narratives, and of leveraging her public persona in ways that few royals have attempted before. The possibility that Meghan's influence could stretch into the very heart of this scandal may seem far-fetched, until you start connecting the dots. From media strategy to subtle leaks, and perhaps even private conversations with allies inside the palace, her fingerprints could be all over the undercurrents that forced Andrew's hand. So why does this matter now? Because the removal of a duke's title is not merely a personal setback. It signals seismic shifts in the monarchy itself. It raises questions about power, accountability, and the influence of figures both inside and outside the palace. It forces us to reconsider long-held assumptions about who holds sway in the royal hierarchy. And most importantly, It shows us that even the most private moments, confessions, secret meetings, strategic interventions, can have public consequences that ripple across the globe. And let's not forget the stakes for Andrew himself. Stepping back from a royal title is not just about prestige. It's about legacy, public perception, and the constant scrutiny that comes with living a life that is simultaneously public and intensely private. Imagine the internal conflict. A man accustomed to privilege and respect, suddenly facing a world that no longer offers him the same deference, forced to navigate the consequences of past associations in a landscape that is unforgiving, relentless, and deeply personal. What happened in the hours leading up to Andrew's confession? Who was present? Which advisors whispered counsel, and which suggested silence? And most importantly, what role did Meghan Markle play in all of this, intentionally, subtly, or even inadvertently? These are the questions that will guide our exploration over the next hour. Each twist, each revelation, will build upon the last, taking you deeper into a world of palace intrigue, family tension, and public spectacle. By the end of this story, you will have a full picture of not just what happened, but why it happened, and how the decisions of a few individuals can send ripples through centuries of royal tradition. You'll see the stakes, the strategies, and the surprises that no headline or official statement could ever fully capture. And yet, as we begin, we are left with the most tantalizing question of all. What exactly did Meghan Markle do or influence in this saga? Was it a calculated intervention, a subtle nudge from afar, or merely the consequence of her unparalleled ability to shape public narrative? The answer is coming. But first, we need to start at the very moment that set everything in motion: Andrew's shocking confession. Could one confession really shake the foundations of the royal family? Could a single admission change decades of public perception, family loyalty, and media narrative all at once? For Prince Andrew, that moment arrived quietly, privately, and yet its consequences were seismic. Behind the closed doors of the palace, surrounded by senior advisors and family members, the Duke of York faced the kind of reckoning most people only see in movies. But this was no fiction. This was real, and it would leave ripples that extended far beyond Buckingham Palace. The story begins in a small, private room somewhere inside the palace complex, far removed from the prying eyes of the press and the world outside. Andrew had been summoned, in a way, to confront not just his public image but the very reality of his choices over the past decade. His connections with Jeffrey Epstein, though widely reported, had never been fully addressed by him in the presence of the family. This wasn't a casual conversation. This wasn't a brief statement for the tabloids. This was a reckoning. And in that room, under the scrutiny of advisors, legal experts, and, eventually, King Charles himself, Andrew spoke. He admitted what no one had expected him to admit so candidly. The words were precise, deliberate, yet heavy with unspoken emotion. There was shame. There was defensiveness. There was a lingering disbelief, almost as if the weight of the truth itself was something he could hardly bear. In that moment, the palace felt the tension of history pressing down. Every eye in the room was fixed on him. Every ear strained to catch the nuance in his voice. It was a confession, but it was also a plea. An attempt to control the narrative before the media did it for him. Yet, as Andrew spoke, the reactions around him were a mix of surprise, disappointment, and, in some corners, a sense of inevitability. The senior members of the royal family, long aware of the public and legal pressures mounting on Andrew, had been waiting for this moment. But what they did not expect was the way he framed it, not just as a personal misstep, but almost as a forced consequence of circumstance. He spoke of mistakes, of lapses in judgment, of choices that, at the time, seemed inconsequential but had grown into something far larger, something that could no longer be ignored. For King Charles, the confession was both a relief and a complication. Relief, because the truth was finally out. The ambiguity, the rumors, the whispers that had haunted palace corridors for years could now be addressed head-on. Complication, because the public reaction, the media frenzy, and the internal dynamics of the royal family were now unavoidable. How do you protect your family while simultaneously protecting the monarchy? How do you address wrongdoing without fracturing centuries of tradition? These were the questions Charles faced in the tense silence of that room. Andrew's confession was not a simple apology. It was layered, complex, and full of contradictions. There was acknowledgement, yes, but also deflection. There was accountability, but also justification. Every sentence seemed to reveal as much as it obscured. For the palace staff listening, for the advisors weighing every word, it was like watching a high-stakes chess game unfold in real time. Every move mattered. Every nuance could shift perception, and every pause carried meaning. And then came the reactions. Subtle at first. A raised eyebrow here. A shift in posture there. The way advisors exchanged glances, the way legal counsel whispered quietly into ears. All of it hinted at the gravity of the situation. Publicly, Andrew had always been a figure of both sympathy and scrutiny. Privately, he was now a man stripped down to the core of accountability, facing the harsh, intimate realities of the choices that had brought him here. The contrast between public persona and private reckoning was stark, almost painful to observe. But the shockwaves of his confession didn't end there. As the words left his lips, there was an undercurrent that few outside the palace would ever fully understand. The involvement of other family members, the subtle influence of strategic advisors, and even the whispers of distant figures like Meghan Markle created a tension that was almost tangible. How much of what Andrew said was influenced by his own conscience? How much was guided by those around him, shaping the message to mitigate fallout? And what role did the unseen players, the media, the public, and external influencers, play in amplifying the consequences? These questions hung in the room like a dense fog, impossible to ignore. The confession also illuminated just how vulnerable Andrew was. Stripped of titles, public respect, and the sheen of privilege that often insulated him, he was forced to confront a reality many might find unbearable. The optics of the situation were brutal. Decades of royal privilege could not shield him from public judgment, from the intense scrutiny of social media, or from the relentless questioning of journalists worldwide. And yet, even in this vulnerable state, there was a determination in Andrew, a desire to reclaim some measure of dignity, to control, as much as possible, the narrative that was spiraling out of his grasp. What made this confession even more explosive was what came next. The immediate ripple effect through the palace. Advisors scrambled, messages were sent to other family members, and discussions about the best way to handle the announcement began in earnest. Timing became everything. Public perception became everything. Every word would be dissected, every nuance analyzed. And while Andrew's admission was personal, its implications were institutional. This was no longer just about him. It was about the monarchy itself. The room, heavy with tension, also held subtle signs of shifting power. Catherine, ever observant, watched, listened, and made mental notes. She recognized the opportunity not just to manage a crisis, but to influence the outcomes in ways that could solidify her position within the monarchy. Every glance, every nod, every suggestion she made was strategic, positioning her as a figure who could guide the family through turbulence. The contrast between Andrew's raw, emotional confession and Catherine's calculated presence was striking, highlighting the different approaches to influence and survival within the royal ecosystem. And then, there was Meghan Markle. Her potential involvement, though not directly in the room, loomed like a shadow. Advisors speculated. Whispers suggested she may have had indirect influence over media narratives, shaping public perception in ways that complicated Andrew's position. Could a figure thousands of miles away really have an impact on a confession taking place in Buckingham Palace? The answer, as the palace slowly realized, was yes. Influence is not always about presence. Sometimes, it is about perception, media manipulation, and the subtle ways stories are steered in public consciousness. By the time the confession concluded, the palace was already bracing for what would come next. Media outlets would be alerted. Statements would need to be crafted. Reputations would be scrutinized. And public reaction, from outrage to disbelief, would arrive almost immediately, fueled by social media, opinion pieces, and the insatiable appetite of a world watching every royal move. Andrew's moment of truth was now a trigger for a cascade of events that would affect not just him, but the entire family, the monarchy, and even figures like Meghan Markle and Catherine, whose involvement was subtle but undeniable. The tension didn't end in that room. Far from it. The palace corridors, once quiet and orderly, now hummed with urgency. Advisors debated next steps. Messages were discreetly sent to ensure the king and other senior royals were aligned on public statements. Every detail was scrutinized, the phrasing of Andrew's acknowledgement, the tone of his voice, even the timing of his words. A single misstep could be disastrous, potentially igniting a media storm far worse than anything previously experienced. And then, the final, chilling realization set in. This confession, while private, was only the beginning. The public, the press, and the world beyond the palace walls would soon react, and Andrew's carefully measured words would be dissected, debated, and judged. There was no turning back. The moment of truth had arrived. The confession had been made. The stage was set for fallout, for power plays, and for revelations that would shock the monarchy and the world alike. What do you do when a crisis lands squarely on your doorstep? A crisis that threatens not just a family member, but the very image and stability of the monarchy itself. For King Charles III, that moment came with Andrew's confession. It was no longer a private matter confined to palace walls. The public had already begun to sense the tension. The media was circling like vultures, and the royal family's centuries-long reputation hung in the balance. Charles had to act decisively, carefully, and strategically, because every decision now carried consequences that would echo for decades. The first challenge was understanding the magnitude of the fallout. Andrew's admission had opened a floodgate. Legal scrutiny, public outrage, and media speculation combined to create a perfect storm. Charles understood better than anyone that the monarchy doesn't survive scandal by ignoring it. Silence would be interpreted as complicity. Hesitation would be seen as weakness. In his study at Buckingham Palace, surrounded by advisors and aides, Charles pored over options. Every potential course of action was weighed against the twin goals of protecting the institution and maintaining family unity. Charles's advisors were clear. Andrew's title as Duke of York could no longer be carried forward without inciting further outrage. It wasn't just about Andrew's past or public opinion. It was about accountability and the message it sent to the world. The monarchy had always relied on a careful balance of tradition, discretion, and public favor. But now, tradition itself was being tested. Could a royal escape consequence simply because of lineage? Would the public accept a member of the family retaining privilege despite scandal? The answer, increasingly, was no. Even so, the decision was not easy. Charles was not just the head of state. He was a brother, a father, a king expected to show both justice and mercy. Andrew, flawed and controversial as he was still family. Charles had spent a lifetime learning how to balance loyalty and duty. Every word he considered, every action he contemplated, carried weight. Should he strip Andrew of his title entirely? Should he allow him to keep some ceremonial roles to preserve dignity? Each option had profound implications. Charles also had to consider timing. The announcement could not appear impulsive, nor could it appear reactive to media pressure. It needed to feel measured, authoritative, and unavoidable. The palace communications team worked in tandem, crafting carefully worded statements designed to convey accountability while managing potential backlash. Charles knew that public perception could make or break the monarchy's credibility, and a misstep here could ignite criticism not just toward Andrew, but toward the crown itself. At the same time, Charles faced an internal conflict. How do you enforce accountability when it involves a family member? How do you act decisively without alienating other relatives or sparking internal fractures? Within the palace, discussions were tense. Advisors and senior royals debated nuances, the phrasing of statements, the level of Andrew's involvement in public duties going forward, the symbolic weight of removing a title versus issuing a reprimand. The room was heavy with the understanding that nothing about this situation was straightforward. Tradition, loyalty, and modern public scrutiny collided in a way the monarchy hadn't faced in decades. Emotional undertones were unavoidable. Charles had to balance personal disappointment, familial loyalty, and the immense responsibility of the crown. This was not a theoretical exercise. Every advisor understood that the wrong decision could ripple outward, impacting public trust, royal morale, and the image of the monarchy for generations. Charles himself reflected on the irony. Decades of careful public service, navigating global diplomacy, managing family expectations, and now, a crisis sparked by one brother threatened to overshadow everything. Public perception was an ever-present concern. The media had already begun speculating about how Andrew would respond, how Charles would act, and how the royal family as a whole would manage the fallout. Opinion polls suggested a growing impatience among the public. They were no longer willing to see privilege as immunity. Social media amplified outrage, with millions weighing in, demanding accountability and questioning the monarchy's commitment to justice. In the palace, advisors monitored every reaction, analyzing potential risks and benefits of each possible action. Charles had to anticipate both public and media response, knowing that missteps could be unforgiving. Meanwhile, internal palace dynamics were shifting. Catherine, already a strategic force, quietly observed, waiting for the right moment to step in. Charles knew that her influence, especially in matters of public perception, could be invaluable. Yet he also understood that relying too heavily on her could create tension, potentially reshaping power dynamics within the family. Every decision required not just judgment about Andrew, but careful navigation of familial relationships. The confessions, reactions, and decisions of one individual now became intertwined with the broader strategic positioning of the monarchy. Charles's choice, when it was finally made, reflected both firmness and pragmatism. The decision to remove Andrew's use of the Duke of York title was announced publicly as a measured step. Accountability for past associations, protection of the monarchy's integrity, and clarity about the expectations of behavior for royal family members. Yet beneath the formal announcement lay layers of negotiation, deliberation, and subtle maneuvering, decisions made behind closed doors that no public statement could fully reveal. Every word of the announcement was chosen to convey authority, stability, and an understanding of the complex emotions involved. The emotional weight of the moment was heavy. Andrew faced public humiliation and personal reckoning, while Charles balanced justice with compassion, strategy with morality. Advisors whispered about long-term consequences, potential backlash, and ripple effects within the family and the public. And yet, even as the announcement was crafted, there was an unspoken acknowledgement. The story was far from over. Media scrutiny, palace politics, and the influence of figures outside the immediate circle, including Meghan Markle, whose potential sway over public perception remained a factor, would continue to complicate the situation. Charles's strategic mind was also focused on precedent. By taking decisive action, he set a clear example. Titles and privileges are contingent upon behavior and accountability. The message was unmistakable. The monarchy is not immune from scrutiny, and personal misconduct has consequences. This was a subtle yet powerful recalibration of expectations for all members of the royal family, reinforcing a standard of conduct and signaling to the public that the institution was willing to act, even when uncomfortable or emotionally complex. And yet, even as the public statement was prepared and the palace braced for reaction, questions lingered. How would Andrew respond privately? How would other senior royals interpret the move? Would Catherine's influence grow as she guided strategy and media management? And perhaps most intriguingly, what role, if any, did Meghan Markle play in shaping the narrative, influencing perception, or nudging public opinion in ways that might indirectly affect the outcome? These uncertainties created an atmosphere of tension that extended far beyond the formal announcement, hinting at further drama yet to unfold. Every moment following Charles's decision was charged with anticipation. The palace operated with meticulous precision, yet even the best-laid plans could not account for all variables. Public reaction, media scrutiny, Andrew's personal response, and the subtle maneuvers of other family members would all play a role in determining how this chapter of royal history would ultimately be remembered. Charles's stand was firm, principled, and necessary, but the human and political complexities ensured that the story was far from concluded. The king had acted, but the ripple effects were only beginning. The removal of a title was not an endpoint. It was the start of a new, unpredictable chapter. The palace braced for the next wave of consequences, whispers, leaks, media speculation, and, inevitably, the reactions of the very individuals who could either stabilize or destabilize the monarchy. Charles's decision had been decisive, but it also opened doors to conflicts, surprises, and revelations that no one could have fully predicted. And behind the scenes, in quiet corners of the palace and beyond, figures like Catherine and Meghan watched, calculated, and waited. Every move, every statement, every subtle gesture would now matter more than ever. The king had taken a stand, but the story was far from over. What do you do when the monarchy is in crisis and the spotlight demands more than just reaction? It demands leadership. For Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, that moment arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet it would become one of the defining points of her influence within the royal family. While the public and the media were focused on Andrew's confession and Charles's decisive action, Catherine was already calculating the moves that could stabilize the monarchy, protect her family, and solidify her role as both a public figure and a behind-the-scenes strategist. The palace corridors are a world of whispers, subtle glances, and carefully measured interactions. In those halls, influence is often invisible. Power is exercised in the smallest gestures, the most strategic words. Catherine understood this better than most. She had spent years cultivating a public image of grace, stability, and relatability, yet beneath that polished exterior was a mind constantly assessing dynamics, evaluating opportunities, and anticipating outcomes. Andrew's scandal presented not just a challenge, but an opening, an opportunity to step into a role the monarchy had never formally defined. The strategist in the shadows, the figure who could act decisively to protect the family and the institution. Her first task was assessing the fallout. Andrew's confession, Charles's decision to remove his title, and the immediate media storm created a tense environment where every misstep could be magnified. Catherine knew that perception mattered as much as action. Public confidence in the monarchy depended on demonstrating both accountability and continuity. Yet there was a delicate balance to maintain. Acting too aggressively could be seen as opportunistic, while hesitating could appear indecisive. She had to navigate a path that asserted her influence without undermining the king, while ensuring that Andrew's humiliation did not destabilize the public image of the royal family as a whole. Catherine's approach was methodical. She began by quietly coordinating with senior advisors, ensuring that every public appearance, statement, and media engagement aligned with the broader strategy. Her goal was to provide stability in the midst of chaos, to reassure the public that, despite scandal, the monarchy remained in control. But she also worked on a subtler level, influencing internal conversations, guiding discussions, and shaping decisions behind closed doors. This was power exercised not through decree, but through insight, foresight, and strategic persuasion. Her influence was not limited to public perception. It extended to the dynamics within the family itself. In the wake of Charles's decisive action, Andrew was left vulnerable, not just publicly, but privately. Catherine's role became one of mediator, strategist, and subtle guide. She offered counsel where needed, framed options in ways that highlighted long-term consequences, and ensured that the family presented a united front even amid tension and uncertainty. She understood that Andrew's response, and the way other royals reacted, would define public interpretation of the crisis. One of Catherine's most significant contributions was anticipating the media response. She had spent years observing how stories about the royal family evolved, noting patterns in coverage, public sentiment, and social media engagement. She recognized that Andrew's removal of his title would dominate headlines, but that public perception could be influenced by timing, tone, and framing. By coordinating with communications experts and quietly guiding messaging, she shaped the narrative to emphasize accountability and stability, while subtly directing attention away from deeper internal fractures that could have damaged the monarchy irreparably. At the same time, Catherine's actions underscored the subtle power plays that define the modern monarchy. She was careful to maintain loyalty to Charles, reinforcing his authority while ensuring that her own role became indispensable. Her presence was both stabilizing and strategic. She could reassure the public, advise the family, and anticipate complications before they arose. In moments of crisis, her ability to act with calm authority became a counterweight to the emotional volatility surrounding Andrew's scandal. But Catherine's influence extended beyond immediate crisis management. she also began to shape long-term perceptions. By positioning herself as a figure of calm and decisive action, she reinforced her image as a modern, capable royal, someone who could navigate public scrutiny, manage internal dynamics, and maintain the dignity of the monarchy. This dual approach, managing both public and private spheres, was what set her apart, and it became increasingly clear that her role in the royal hierarchy was evolving in ways that few had anticipated. Yet, even as Catherine stepped into the spotlight, challenges remained. Andrew's personal reactions, the reactions of other family members, and the influence of external figures like Meghan Markle added layers of complexity. Catherine had to anticipate moves that could destabilize her carefully constructed strategy. Could Andrew resist her guidance? Would other royals assert influence in ways that contradicted her plans? And how might Meghan's actions, or her influence over media narratives, impact the family's public image? These uncertainties required not just foresight, but adaptability, an ability to adjust strategy in real time while maintaining an overarching plan. In addition, Catherine's interventions were not without risk. Acting too visibly could be interpreted as overreach, potentially upsetting traditional hierarchies and provoking criticism from both the public and internal royal circles. She had to balance assertiveness with discretion, influence with subtlety. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, carried weight. Every decision had the potential to shape public perception and internal dynamics in profound ways. Catherine's ability to navigate this terrain demonstrated a rare combination of empathy, intelligence, and strategic vision. She understood the human element of the crisis, Andrew's vulnerability, Charles's need for authority, the family's collective interest, while simultaneously anticipating the broader consequences of each move. Her actions highlighted the evolving nature of power within the monarchy, where influence is exercised not just through titles and public visibility, but through insight, timing, and the ability to shape outcomes behind the scenes. And yet, even as Catherine's influence became increasingly apparent, there were still unknown variables. Andrew's next moves, the reactions of other senior royals, the media's evolving narrative, and Meghan Markle's subtle influence all remained factors that could disrupt her carefully laid plans. Catherine had positioned herself as a stabilizing force, but the storm surrounding the palace was far from over. Every action taken, every decision made, had the potential to trigger unforeseen consequences. By stepping into this role, Catherine transformed a crisis into an opportunity. She became not just a figure of support, but a strategist, a mediator, and a stabilizing force capable of shaping both family dynamics and public perception. Her ability to navigate complex emotions, anticipate consequences, and act decisively under pressure underscored her growing importance within the monarchy. The palace, which had long relied on tradition and hierarchy, now witnessed a new kind of influence, one rooted in insight, strategy, and the ability to act when it mattered most. But even as Catherine solidified her position, a new question emerged. What influence, if any, did Meghan Markle have in this unfolding drama? Could her actions, public statements, or behind-the-scenes influence shift the narrative in ways that complicated Catherine's careful strategy? The answer, as the palace would soon discover, was more complicated than anyone expected, and it would set the stage for revelations that no one inside or outside the monarchy could have predicted. Could someone thousands of miles away, across an ocean, truly influence a crisis unfolding inside the royal palace? Most people would say no. Meghan Markle, living her life in California, raising her family, and building her brand, seemed far removed from the turmoil surrounding Prince Andrew and the royal family. And yet, as the weeks following Andrew's confession unfolded, subtle signs suggested her presence, or at least her influence, was more tangible than anyone might have imagined. The story begins not with a headline, not with a public statement, but with whispers. Sources close to palace insiders began noting unusual media activity, strategic leaks, narratives framed in ways that highlighted Andrew's past while emphasizing broader issues of accountability and public trust. Observers, both inside and outside the palace, started to ask the same question. Could Meghan Markle, through her mastery of media and public perception, be shaping the narrative from afar? Meghan's approach, as always, was calculated. She understands the power of public perception like few royals or celebrities before her. Every statement, every public appearance, every subtle gesture is designed to influence how the world interprets her actions. In this case, she didn't need to be physically present in London to leave her mark. Strategic leaks, carefully timed interviews, and the amplification of certain narratives through sympathetic media outlets created an environment that indirectly increased pressure on Andrew while framing the monarchy's response in a broader context of accountability and scrutiny. What made Meghan's potential involvement particularly intriguing was its subtlety. Unlike the overt actions of Catherine or the formal authority of King Charles, Meghan's influence operated in the shadows of public discourse. She didn't need to issue commands or make statements directly about Andrew. Instead, her influence was indirect, woven into the broader media ecosystem. Headlines that focused on accountability, social media campaigns highlighting ethical responsibility, and interviews that touched on themes of justice and transparency. All of these served to reinforce pressure on Andrew and shape public expectations for the monarchy. Palace insiders began to notice patterns. Stories that might have been dismissed as routine coverage were emerging with timing and emphasis that suggested orchestration. Certain journalists with known connections to Meghan's circle were covering aspects of the scandal in ways that increased public scrutiny. Leaks seemed too precise to be coincidental. Analysts inside Buckingham Palace quietly began mapping out these media dynamics, trying to determine whether Meghan's influence was deliberate, indirect, or simply a byproduct of her public persona. Her potential involvement also had a psychological impact on Andrew. Even if he was unaware of Meghan's influence, the perception of being under scrutiny intensified his vulnerability. The public narrative, shaped by media framing and subtle cues, amplified his sense of exposure and the consequences of his past actions. Andrew was already grappling with personal shame and public humiliation. The added perception that Meghan Markle, a figure long perceived as distant and removed, could be influencing events created another layer of pressure, subtly affecting decisions, reactions, and internal palace dynamics. Catherine, aware of Meghan's possible influence, had to adjust her strategy. While she maintained control over immediate crisis management and public perception within the palace, she also recognized that Meghan's reach outside the walls could not be ignored. Every statement, every public appearance by Meghan had the potential to reshape the narrative, to challenge the careful positioning Catherine had worked to maintain. This required constant vigilance, adaptability, and foresight. Catherine needed to anticipate both Andrew's reactions and the ripple effects of Meghan's indirect influence on public sentiment. The complexity of Meghan's role also highlighted an evolving reality for the modern monarchy. Traditional authority, based on lineage, titles, and formal hierarchy, was now intersecting with the power of media, celebrity influence, and public narrative. Meghan Markle exemplifies this new kind of influence. Not through formal roles or direct authority, but through perception management and the ability to shape public discourse from a distance. Her actions underscored how the monarchy could no longer rely solely on internal control. External factors, strategic narratives, and media influence now played a crucial role in shaping outcomes. Even more intriguing were the subtle indications that Meghan may have had allies within the palace. Individuals who understood her strategies and could leverage them to guide certain outcomes. These were not overt collaborators, but insiders attuned to the rhythms of public perception and media dynamics. Their alignment with Meghan's indirect influence created a network of subtle pressure points, further complicating Andrew's ability to navigate the crisis without misstep. The timing of certain events also raised eyebrows. Public statements, media releases, and even the sequencing of Andrew's legal and financial disclosures seemed to coincide with narratives that amplified scrutiny. While some insiders argued these were coincidences, others saw the fingerprints of careful orchestration. Could Meghan Markle, from thousands of miles away, be subtly steering the situation? It's a question that few inside the palace dared to confront openly, yet it lingered like a shadow over every conversation, every strategy session, and every public response. Adding to the intrigue was the interplay between Meghan's influence and Catherine's strategic positioning. While Catherine worked to stabilize the monarchy from within, Meghan's subtle presence outside created a dynamic tension. One was internal, grounded in formal authority and proximity. The other was external, rooted in narrative influence and media strategy. The intersection of these two forces, one visible, one largely invisible, would define the unfolding drama in ways that neither could fully control. This delicate balance also had emotional consequences for the key players. Andrew, feeling the weight of public scrutiny and personal shame, was forced to navigate a landscape where not only the monarchy but external influencers were shaping his options. Charles, while maintaining authority, had to consider both internal and external pressures when making decisions. Catherine, ever vigilant, had to manage both the optics and the human dynamics of a family under unprecedented scrutiny. And Meghan, from a distance, exerted influence in ways that highlighted the power of perception over proximity, demonstrating that control could be exercised without ever stepping inside the palace walls. The story, however, did not stop at influence and perception. It was also about the unfolding consequences of these subtle interventions. Andrew's next moves, his legal maneuvers, his public statements, all would be affected by this invisible web of pressure. Every decision carried weight not just for him personally, but for the monarchy, for Charles's authority, and for the broader public perception of royal accountability. The interplay between internal strategy, external influence, and public scrutiny created a dynamic that few had ever seen within the royal family. By the end of this phase, it became clear that Meghan Markle's role, though indirect, distant, and largely invisible, was significant. Her influence, whether deliberate or incidental, reshaped the dynamics of the crisis, complicating Andrew's position and highlighting the evolving power structures within the monarchy. This was a moment that redefined the rules of engagement. In the modern royal landscape, influence is no longer determined solely by proximity or title, but by the ability to shape narratives, manipulate perception, and anticipate reactions. And as the palace braced for the next chapter, the legal fallout, media storm, and internal confrontations, one question lingered. How far would Meghan Markle's influence extend? Could her actions, or the perception of her involvement, push the royal family into moves they were unprepared for? How do you confront the world when every misstep, every word, and every gesture is under a microscope? For Prince Andrew, that question had become his daily reality. The private reckoning inside Buckingham Palace had spilled into public view, and the consequences were far more severe than any royal could have anticipated. The removal of his Duke of York title was just the beginning. Now came the relentless scrutiny of the press, the weight of public opinion, and the looming shadow of legal accountability. The moment Andrew stepped outside the palace walls after the announcement, he entered a battlefield he could no longer control. Media vans lined the streets. Cameras captured every expression, every reaction. Headlines screamed with judgment. Social media erupted with commentary ranging from anger to disbelief. What had once been a private shame was now public spectacle. Every move Andrew made was analyzed, dissected, and framed within the context of his association with Jeffrey Epstein, creating a narrative that left little room for nuance. Legal pressures mounted alongside public scrutiny. Lawyers, both his and those representing victims, were already moving to ensure that accountability could not be delayed. Settlement discussions, potential lawsuits, and civil claims created an environment in which Andrew's every action had legal implications. Decisions that might have seemed minor in isolation were now loaded with consequences, and even the smallest misstep could escalate into a significant legal or financial liability. Every word he spoke, every appearance he made, needed to be strategically calculated, yet emotion, personal history, and the intensity of scrutiny made such precision nearly impossible. The public narrative was unforgiving. Opinion polls indicated a steep decline in trust toward Andrew and, by extension, toward the monarchy. Social media platforms became echo chambers of outrage and condemnation, amplifying stories of his past and leaving little room for forgiveness or contextualization. Public relations experts within the palace struggled to contain the damage. Every interview and every statement was dissected for inconsistency, tone, and perceived sincerity. For Andrew, the The court of public opinion was as punishing as any legal tribunal. Even within the family, pressure was mounting. Charles had taken a decisive stand, and Catherine had begun exerting her influence strategically, but Andrew still faced the emotional consequences of being isolated from key supporters. The court, advisors, and senior royals all maintained a measured distance, balancing empathy with the need to protect the monarchy's image. Andrew was left to confront not only his personal failings, but also the reality of navigating a world where loyalty could not shield him from scrutiny. Financial concerns added another layer of stress. Beyond legal costs, Andrew had to consider the impact of losing his title on personal income, charitable connections, and sponsorships. Privilege that once insulated him was eroding. He was entering a new reality in which personal responsibility, public perception, and accountability converged, demanding strategies he had rarely needed before. The Duke of York was no longer just a title. It was a symbol of expectation and consequence, and its removal signaled a profound shift in his personal and public life. Meanwhile, the media frenzy created unpredictable variables. Every public appearance, from charity events to casual engagements, was scrutinized. Reporters looked for inconsistencies, expressions of guilt or defiance, and any hint of evasion. Leaks and insider stories appeared with alarming regularity, creating a sense of chaos around Andrew's attempts to regain control of his narrative. Even advisors struggled to maintain coherence in the messaging, as every statement had potential repercussions across multiple platforms and audiences. The legal dimension of the crisis added unprecedented pressure. Victims' advocates were relentless, courts demanded accountability, and public calls for transparency intensified. Andrew's legal team faced a delicate balancing act: protect him from liability, manage media exposure, and attempt to negotiate settlements where appropriate. Every action was strategically designed to minimize risk, yet the very nature of the allegations meant that complete control was impossible. Even small missteps could be magnified and used against him. Public perception became a weapon as much as a challenge. Social media campaigns, opinion columns, and online commentary created an environment in which Andrew was constantly under fire. The public was divided. Some argued for personal accountability without extending the criticism to the monarchy as a whole, while others believed that his actions were emblematic of systemic privilege and unaccountability within the royal family. The polarized discourse intensified pressure on Charles, Catherine, and other senior royals to act decisively while managing internal family dynamics. The psychological toll on Andrew was immense. Isolation, public shame, and legal entanglement combined to create stress that affected his personal judgment. Advisors noted that even routine decisions became fraught with anxiety. Every move required careful consideration, and yet the relentless pace of media coverage and public discussion left little room for strategic breathing space. Andrew was no longer simply a royal. He was a public figure under siege, navigating a complex interplay of legal, familial, and social pressures. Catherine's role during this period became increasingly critical. She was both a stabilizing presence and a strategic advisor, ensuring that Andrew's public actions did not further damage the monarchy. Her guidance was subtle but effective, framing appearances, timing statements, and coordinating with media teams to manage perception. While Andrew struggled with the public and legal pressures, Catherine operated with calm authority, navigating both the optics and the real-world consequences of the unfolding drama. And then there was Meghan Markle's indirect influence. Strategic leaks, public narratives emphasizing accountability, and media attention framed in ways that reflected broader cultural expectations amplified Andrew's pressure. Whether deliberate or coincidental, Meghan's role added another layer of complexity, highlighting how external influence can intersect with internal crises to create unpredictable outcomes. Andrew's attempts to manage his public image were complicated by forces far beyond his immediate control, demonstrating the evolving dynamics of influence in the modern monarchy. As Andrew faced this maelstrom of public and legal pressure, one thing became clear: the removal of his title was more than symbolic. It marked a turning point in his life, transforming personal scandal into a public reckoning with consequences that could not be avoided. Legal proceedings, media scrutiny, and internal family dynamics converged to create a high-stakes environment in which every action mattered, every word carried weight, and every decision could trigger further escalation. The palace watched closely. Every move Andrew made was evaluated not only for its immediate impact, but also for its long-term implications. Charles and Catherine understood that the stability of the monarchy depended on navigating this crisis carefully, ensuring that accountability was maintained without fracturing the institution. Advisors monitored media responses, public sentiment, and legal developments with intense scrutiny, recognizing that each factor could influence the others in unpredictable ways. And as the story unfolded, one truth became undeniable. Andrew's personal crisis had become a catalyst for broader shifts within the royal family. It revealed the delicate interplay between public perception, internal strategy, and external influence. It tested the monarchy's ability to respond decisively while maintaining cohesion. And it underscored the evolving role of figures like Catherine and Meghan, whose influence, whether direct or indirect, would shape outcomes in ways that the palace could only partially control. What happens when private family conflicts collide with public scrutiny? In the royal family, the line between personal and public is virtually non-existent. For Charles, Catherine, and Andrew, the events following the Duke of York's confession did not just play out on camera or in newspapers. They unfolded behind closed doors, in hallways, sitting rooms, and private offices where words carried weight far beyond their immediate audience. Behind the polished public statements and carefully staged appearances, tensions simmered, alliances shifted, and the stakes were deeply personal. The first cracks became evident in early palace meetings. Andrew, bruised by the loss of his title and the intensity of public scrutiny, often reacted with defensiveness, frustration, and at times, open resentment. These reactions, while understandable on a personal level, complicated the family dynamic. Charles, despite his authority as king, had to navigate these emotional waters delicately. His approach required balancing firmness with empathy, showing Andrew the consequences of his actions while maintaining the dignity and cohesion of the family. Catherine, meanwhile, operated as both mediator and strategist. She could sense the volatility in the room and understood the importance of managing both emotion and optics. When Andrew became defensive or lapsed into anger, Catherine's presence acted as a stabilizing influence. She reframed discussions, redirected attention to practical solutions, and subtly guided conversations to avoid escalation. Her role was indispensable, not merely in managing appearances, but in preserving family cohesion at a time when fractures could become irreparable. The tension was not limited to Andrew. Other family members, from senior royals to advisors, struggled to find their place within this new reality. Long-standing alliances and loyalties were tested. Some sympathized with Andrew's predicament, seeing a man under siege. Others recognized the necessity of decisive action to protect the monarchy's reputation. These differing perspectives created undercurrents of friction, requiring Charles and Catherine to exercise strategic patience. Every decision, every conversation, had the potential to either calm the storm or inflame it further. Private conversations revealed stark contradictions. Andrew often expressed surprise at the intensity of public outrage, struggling to reconcile his perception of his own actions with the reality of public sentiment. Charles and Catherine, while understanding his personal perspective, had to consistently pivot back to the broader responsibility of maintaining the monarchy's credibility. These tensions were compounded by the constant awareness that even private words could leak, potentially reigniting media scrutiny or misrepresenting the family's intentions. The situation also highlighted the psychological strain on all involved. Constant scrutiny, high-stakes decisions, and intense emotional pressures created an environment where tempers flared easily. Charles, burdened by the dual responsibilities of father and king, had to maintain composure, even as he managed conflicting loyalties. Catherine, while strategically positioned, was under pressure to mediate effectively while protecting her own family's public image. Andrew, meanwhile, faced a deeply personal reckoning, forced to confront both his past and the public's judgment. Media dynamics only intensified internal tension. Leaks, rumors, and speculation created an almost theatrical environment where palace members had to anticipate public interpretation of private moments. Every sigh, every glance, and every carefully chosen word risked becoming headline material. This reality added pressure to every conversation, making honest emotional expression fraught with risk. The family was performing constantly, balancing authenticity against the need to maintain an image of unity and authority. Catherine's role became increasingly prominent as she navigated these tensions. Beyond managing optics, she worked to anticipate potential conflicts before they erupted. She advised Charles on messaging, counseled Andrew on public interactions, and coordinated with palace staff to ensure coherence in both private and public actions. Her influence extended to emotional management, helping temper conflicts and redirect conversations toward productive outcomes. This subtle orchestration was critical. Without it, the internal strain could have easily escalated into public scandal beyond Andrew's title controversy. Even small disagreements carried outsized consequences. A minor disagreement over phrasing in a public statement could trigger weeks of speculation. Differences in opinion regarding Andrew's public appearances could inflame tensions internally and externally. Every choice had to be weighed against both immediate and long-term repercussions. Within these high-stakes environments, family members learned that personal feelings could not dominate decisions, yet suppressing emotion entirely risked creating resentment, misunderstanding, or fracture. Meanwhile, the interplay between internal tension and public perception created additional complications. The family could not act as if isolated from media scrutiny. Any misalignment in tone, statement, or behavior could be amplified by journalists and social media, feeding speculation and potentially undermining the monarchy's authority. Catherine, Charles, and Andrew each had to navigate the dual realities of private strategy and public accountability, balancing emotional honesty with disciplined communication. The weight of history compounded the strain. Andrew's scandal was not just a personal crisis. It threatened to redefine public perception of the monarchy in a modern era where accountability and transparency are demanded. Past royal scandals had always been managed with discretion, often shielded from public view. But this moment, magnified by media and social media, was different. Every decision carried symbolic significance, and internal disagreements risked reinforcing perceptions of dysfunction or privilege unchecked by responsibility. Family dinners, meetings, and even casual encounters became exercises in diplomacy. Andrew's defensiveness, Charles's insistence on principle, and Catherine's strategic guidance created a delicate choreography. Misstep could inflame tension. Overcorrection could create the perception of weakness. Navigating this landscape required emotional intelligence, tactical foresight, and the ability to anticipate reactions both inside the family and in public perception. Complicating matters further was the indirect influence of Meghan Markle. From afar, her subtle media presence and strategic positioning continued to shape narratives around accountability, justice, and public expectation. Even though Meghan was not physically present, her influence created ripple effects that affected internal discussions, decisions, and perceptions of Andrew's actions. Catherine had to factor this external variable into her calculations, understanding that modern crises no longer existed solely within palace walls. They were amplified by global media dynamics and influential external voices. By the end of this period, the palace was a tense ecosystem of strategic maneuvering, emotional negotiation, and careful image management. Charles maintained authority, Catherine wielded subtle influence, and Andrew navigated both personal shame and public scrutiny. Each decision, conversation, and interaction contributed to the unfolding drama, with implications far beyond the immediate crisis. And as tensions simmered, one truth became increasingly clear. The private struggles behind palace doors were just the beginning. The next series of revelations, interventions, and public reactions would push the family into uncharted territory, forcing alliances, loyalties, and influence to collide in ways no one could have predicted. What happens when private indiscretions collide with public law? For Prince Andrew, the aftermath of losing his Duke of York title was only the prelude to a far more punishing ordeal. Legal pressures, both looming and immediate, now converged on him with a force that threatened not just his reputation, but his personal freedom, finances, and the perception of the monarchy itself. The palace had prepared for public backlash, for media scrutiny, even for Andrew's emotional volatility. But nothing could fully mitigate the weight of impending legal consequences. The storm began quietly, behind the polished facades of courtrooms and legal offices. Lawyers for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein's network were moving aggressively, seeking not just restitution but accountability from every individual associated with the late financier. Andrew's prior connection, once a whispered scandal, had become the centerpiece of multiple legal strategies. Documents were requested, evidence analyzed, and testimonies gathered with painstaking attention. Each development was reported, dissected, and amplified by the media, creating a sense of relentless pressure. Andrew's legal team, experienced and meticulous, faced a high-stakes balancing act. They had to protect their client from escalating liability, anticipate every potential move by the plaintiffs, and navigate an environment where public perception could influence outcomes. The stakes were immense. Unlike ordinary civil cases, every misstep was magnified because of Andrew's public profile, royal connections, and the global attention on every legal maneuver. A single miscalculated statement, poorly timed settlement, or leaked document could become a headline, fueling public outrage and complicating negotiations. Behind closed doors, Andrew faced moments of profound isolation. While public apologies and press statements were carefully crafted, the reality of facing legal scrutiny daily was draining. Each court filing, each deposition, each negotiation session demanded attention, precision, and the ability to anticipate opponent strategies. The psychological toll was immense. Advisors noted how the combination of personal shame, public judgment, and legal complexity created heightened stress, eroding patience, and making decision-making more difficult. The palace, aware of the stakes, operated cautiously. Charles had to ensure that Andrew's legal troubles did not spill over in ways that undermined the monarchy. Every statement, every public appearance, and every interaction with the press was coordinated to maintain both the integrity of the institution and the dignity of those involved. Catherine's role was equally critical. By managing communications, advising on public-facing actions, and controlling internal narratives, she helped mitigate additional fallout. Her strategy was subtle but essential: stabilize the family while allowing legal processes to unfold externally. Meanwhile, the media had a field day. Every new legal filing became fodder for headlines, opinion pieces, and social media commentary. Analysts debated Andrew's potential liability, speculated on settlement amounts, and dissected his behavior both past and present. The public, now intensely aware of the scandal, reacted in polarized ways. Some demanded complete accountability, viewing the legal proceedings as overdue justice. Others questioned the fairness of targeting royalty, arguing that his status should not make him a public scapegoat. In this volatile environment, Andrew's every move carried weight far beyond the courtroom. Financial pressures intensified as well. Legal fees mounted, potential settlements loomed, and Andrew's previously protected status as a duke no longer provided immunity from scrutiny or consequence. Advisors calculated costs, projected exposure, and explored risk mitigation strategies. But even the most meticulous planning could not fully insulate Andrew from escalating demands or unpredictable developments. Every financial decision now intersected with legal strategy, public perception, and internal family considerations. Even within the palace, tension rose. Charles monitored developments closely, balancing a king's duty with a brother's concern. He understood the broader impact. Andrew's legal troubles were not only personal challenges, but public tests of the monarchy's accountability. Catherine, aware of the external pressures, worked tirelessly to control optics while subtly shaping internal discussions. The family dynamic became a high-stakes chess game, where emotional impulses and legal realities collided, and every move required careful calculation. Complicating matters further were Meghan Markle's indirect influences. Strategic narratives she had cultivated, emphasizing accountability, justice, and transparency, continued to amplify public scrutiny of Andrew's legal situation. Even from across the Atlantic, Her actions subtly shaped the environment in which negotiations and court proceedings occurred. Advisors within the palace had to account for this external variable, adjusting messaging and timing to anticipate shifts in public sentiment driven by media framing. Andrew himself struggled to maintain composure. Depositions, interviews, and private consultations revealed the intense personal toll of the legal storm. Advisors noted a man constantly on edge, aware that any misstep could be catastrophic. Every day, the interplay between legal strategy, public perception, and familial expectation created a pressure cooker environment. Mistakes were not merely personal. They could have ramifications for the monarchy, for the stability of public trust, and for the perception of royal accountability worldwide. The courtroom battles were just one dimension. Behind the scenes, negotiation tables, confidential settlements, and private discussions with lawyers added layers of complexity. Andrew had to weigh the risks of public confrontation against the potential benefits of discreet resolution. Legal experts debated strategy endlessly: when to settle, when to fight, and how to manage public interpretation of every action. For Andrew, every choice was fraught with consequence, and every delay increased pressure from both the public and his legal opponents. This period also revealed the interdependence of legal strategy and media management. A single leak or misinterpreted statement could influence negotiations, sway public opinion, and impact the perception of Andrew's accountability. Catherine and palace communications teams worked meticulously to ensure alignment, carefully managing every detail while preparing for worst-case scenarios. Meanwhile, Andrew's legal advisors had to anticipate the intersection of law and perception, understanding that in the modern royal landscape, courtrooms and public opinion are inseparable. As legal proceedings intensified, one truth became clear: Andrew's battle was no longer just personal. It was emblematic of broader questions about accountability, privilege, and the monarchy's role in a modern, media-driven world. Every action, legal or otherwise, was scrutinized not just for immediate effect, but for its historical and cultural implications. Andrew's missteps became a lens through which the public assessed the monarchy's credibility, resilience, and commitment to justice. And just when it seemed that Andrew's legal and public pressures had reached their peak, a new development emerged, a revelation that would shock the palace, the public, and even Andrew himself. This revelation would force the